Welcome to Inside Xi's China, the Great Game Plan. In this episode, you will find out how much did the founder of modern-day China, Mao Zedong, shape his country. Besides setting the terms of engagement with India and America, he also institutionalized the Communist Party's tight grip over the private life of Chinese citizens and trampling even their most basic civil rights.
There is no emperor, but there is Mao. His presence is more widespread than theirs ever was. Wherever I turn, I see the cherubic face of Mao. Millions of his portraits, hundreds of millions of his little red books have been distributed around China.
Mao's dictatorial style later became a model for subsequent leaders to emulate. As he stifled any possibility of individual freedom, Mao also displayed no appetite for any difference of opinion. Mao created and perpetuated his cult status and brought into force political purge as a regular practice to contain any opposition. Even the present-day concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims owe their origins to Mao Zedong. As the founder of present-day China, Mao succeeded in reuniting a fragmented mainland China. He fought victoriously against the Americans in the 1950s in the Korean War, against India in the early 1960s, and against the Vietnamese in the 1970s. This was a complete contrast from China before 1949, when it lost every war during the 1840 to 1949 period. As Mao scripted history both within and outside China, he was driven by actions of fellow comrade Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had delegitimized communist icon Joseph Stalin. In just 3 years of Stalin's death, Khrushchev denounced the Russian dictator and the personality cult he had propagated. Khrushchev also spoke about the excesses that had become a hallmark of Stalin's style of ruling Russia. The de-Stalinization of Russia under Khrushchev made Mao wary of a similar possibility in China. After all, for Mao, a fate like Stalin meant a ruined legacy. But Khrushchev's public condemnation of Stalin also offered Chairman Mao the prospect of becoming the main pivot of socialism around the world. And Mao Zedong acted on this prospect, not once, but twice, each time with more disastrous consequences. Nikita Khrushchev's historic February 1956 secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union came at a time when Mao Zedong was fixing his image. In late 1956, Mao had launched the 100 Flowers movement, where critics of the party were welcome and intellectuals were encouraged to speak their mind against any policy. But little did Mao know that this would open floodgates for criticism that ranged from calls for human rights to having a free press. Mao was shocked to learn that Liu Shaoqi, his closest confidant and possible successor, also advocated adequate legal safeguards for counter-revolutionaries. These were progressive reforms that went against Mao's core beliefs of ruling with an iron fist. Soon, Mao cracked the whip since the avalanche of criticism was too much to take. Mao declared that poisonous weeds had to be removed from the fragrant flowers, and thus came an end to the 100 Flower movement.
He does not have to go to the people every 4 years for a mandate.
Stalin's fall was also a cautionary tale for Mao on the limits to allowing criticism. Betraying those who responded to his clarion call, Mao launched the anti-rightist movement. The campaign was a systematic targeting of all those who voiced their views during the 100 Flower campaign. Anyone who disagreed with the chairman was doomed. It was said that 1 in every 20 Chinese was a rightist and had to be identified, and this allowed the cadre to act on their whims. It also set the stage for Mao's first attempt to replace Soviet Union as the fountainhead of communism. To Mao, the timing seemed right since by then Khrushchev had announced peaceful coexistence with the West. To the communist leadership in China, Khrushchev's position represented a grave ideological dilution. To Mao, it represented an opportunity to permanently shift the communist power center away from Soviet Union to China and to him.
Khrushchev denounced Stalin. While it was a bit of a surprise to Mao and he didn't like it for the top leader to be denounced by his former lieutenant, Mao was also not totally displeased because it gave China the scope to try to assert itself more within the communist bloc as a worthy, with Mao as a worthy successor to Stalin rather than Khrushchev.
To prove his brand of communism was superior, Chairman Mao felt it was important for China to become a center of industrial power. This would ensure that as a leader, Mao would be regarded as bigger than any Russian leader in the global pecking order. And so began the process of collectivization. Everything from farms to agricultural equipment were pooled in to form giant communes. People's land, cattle, equipment, just about everything was taken away from them as they were made part of a giant production machinery to create ever large amounts of food. This food had to be consumed by the commune, had to be sent to the industrial workers, and was meant to be exported. As party officials exaggerated figures about produce and made incorrect claims of a bumper harvest, taxes were increased from 20 to 28%. In reality, agricultural produce had fallen by a whopping 30%. What followed was widespread hunger, deprivation, and starvation as farmers had to fork out ever-growing portions as taxes. Though there are no official estimates, some experts believe as many as 40 million Chinese died due to Mao's madness.
Mao Zedong was responsible for somewhere between, let's say, 30 to 70 million unnatural deaths. That's because of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and other disasters. That toll is horrific. China fell behind. This is, I think, an unmitigated disaster for the Chinese people.
This was the Great Leap Forward. Launched in 1957, the program followed the brutal campaign that targeted many critics and intellectuals. It seems most rational and bold voices in China had then been silenced, and no one had the courage to inform Mao about the damage his harebrained ideas were doing to the country. Deaths were predominantly in the rural areas, but the impact was significant even in urban areas, which had a completely different story to tell. Goaded to produce ever large amounts of steel, workers in cities and towns were required to melt everything they could to produce steel. This even included the pots and pans in their kitchens. Almost overnight, backyard furnaces sprang up all across China. Melting household items was part of Mao's idyllic vision to outproduce Great Britain and become a global power. In 1957, China produced 5.35 million tons of steel, and Mao wished to double this to 10.7 million tons the following year. Instead, the steel that came out of the mammoth melting project was worthless. As suffering peaked and the disaster of the Great Leap Forward became clear, Mao was pushed to the side. In 1959, Mao took formal responsibility of the devastation that was his creation and one of the worst man-made disasters ever. Taking responsibility for the colossal failure, Mao resigned as the head of state, and the moderate Liu Shaoqi was tasked with economic policy making. But Mao continued to be the chairman of the Communist Party, and his word was the final word. But within 5 years, Mao made another comeback. This was his second attempt to become the pivot of the socialist world and to ensure he didn't meet the same fate as Stalin. The result, though, was as disastrous as his previous attempt. Citing the need to attack the culture of bourgeois and capitalist rulers, in 1966, the infamous Cultural Revolution was announced. Mao incited his young and highly radicalized and fanatic supporters to undo anything that tied China to its bourgeois past.
So now, Mao launches a vast new purge called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It is neither proletarian nor cultural, and certainly not a revolution.
Mao used his choreographed swimming spectacle to launch the decade-long Cultural Revolution. Seen swimming in his customary float, the Chinese media claim Mao crossed the mighty Yangtze River a record 10 times. The exercise was aimed to ingrain Mao's position as the only leader capable of lifting China out of its past and guide it towards a glorious future. Armies of Red Guards, who swore by Mao's Little Red Book, went about vandalizing libraries, destructing civilizational treasures, and targeting anyone whom they felt was not a revolutionary in the class struggle. Soon, teachers, professors, scientists, writers, everyone were attacked. They were publicly humiliated and even beaten to death.
Mao launched the Cultural Revolution officially to give revolutionary experience to the young people of China so that they could keep the flame of the revolution going. Now, reality was much more mundane. Mao brought utter disaster to China in the Great Leap Forward, causing something like 40 million or more people being starved to death in a period of 3 years in peacetime. As a result of that, he was being sidelined, and his colleagues were trying to push China in a more pragmatic direction. Mao did not like that. And since he could not get the Communist Party to do what he wanted, he decided to bring his former lieutenants and the party structure to a collapse in order to seize power again and re-establish his control over China and take China back in the direction he wanted to go. And that's essentially what the Cultural Revolution really was about. It was a power struggle that has gone totally wild.
China descended into utter chaos as multiple red armies came up and were taking on each other. The armies and their cadre all were driven by loyalty to Mao and Mao alone, not to the party. As goals kept shifting, the revolution changed from identifying capitalist tendencies to purging the Communist Party itself. Mao had unleashed a social revolution at an unprecedented scale where young people were asked to denounce the CCP party members.
A religion whose Bible in China is the Little Red Book of Mao's quotations. Instead of the icons and statues of Christianity, there is Mao in white plaster and cheerful paint. Instead of medals, there are buttons to be worn on the jacket. Like a Roman religious procession, pictures are carried at the head of marching bands of youths, Red Guards, or peasants. This new religion demands total faith, total obedience. And in return, it promises that miracles will be accomplished. And the masses believe it.
Martial law became the only way to rein in the Red Guards. As the army took control of all aspects of life, widespread persecution followed. In Guangdong alone, over 40,000 people were killed or died due to brutal torture. But China's devastation moved few. Since Western elites were experimenting with communist ideals, they considered China as the epitome of class struggle. Many denounced the Beatles' hit song Revolution for its portrayal of Chairman Mao.
You better free your mind instead. But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow.
And it is unlikely that John Lennon would have worn the Mao badge in 1971 if he knew the sheer scale of human catastrophe that took place under Mao's watch. During this period, Mao was the final authority and made all decisions in China, although he often allowed for debate. As he rolled out the ill-conceived Cultural Revolution, the top party hierarchy lived in abject fear of Chairman Mao. One such instance was the first Central Committee plenum of the 9th Party Congress in 1969, where Chairman Mao could not even convince a single leader to express their opinion.
Old Dong won't talk. Who will talk? Come on, this is a Politburo meeting. Be a little democratic. I have nothing new to say. Well, shall we continue the meeting? You all won't talk.
That's about it. Then let's end the meeting.
This was Mao's model that later came to define the iron fist that dictated how top Chinese leaders ran their country, with unquestioned authority. Mao purged his political rivals or those who questioned his irrational decisions. These included the former premier Liu Shaoqi, who was expelled from the party since he questioned the Cultural Revolution. Parallels can be drawn to the present period under Xi Jinping, where political rivals like Bo Xilai and Zhao Yongkang have been given life imprisonment. They crossed Xi's path and were ostensibly caught in the anti-corruption campaign.
Today, people look at the disaster of the Maoist years and say, oh, Mao is just an aberration. Then they say that Deng Xiaoping normalized politics, institutionalized the Communist Party, put China on a better path. But today, we also have another Mao-like strongman, Xi Jinping. So it looks like strongman, one-man rule is really the norm for the Communist Party, which idealizes struggle. And it looks like the Deng years are really the aberration. And so we have to understand the nature of Chinese communism, and it is more like Mao than it is like Deng.
But that wasn't all. These images bear testimony to how Mao Zedong treated both dissent and dissenters under his tenure. These images and graphic videos are of Laogai, Chinese concentration camps that were built by Mao Zedong during the 1950s. As many as 1,000 concentration camps were built across China, which were modeled on the Russian Gulag, where forced labor was the order of the day. Mao Zedong was inspired by fellow comrade and strongman Joseph Stalin to build Laogai to deal with what he felt was unlawful and unjustified dissent against the state. Since China does not allow any access to Laogai, such reports came out much later by those who were able to survive the ordeal and narrate it to the global audience. In 1994, China was forced to rename these labor camps as re-education centers. But the practice continues unabated. Xi Jinping has used these very concentration camps to keep large population in the Xinjiang region under detention centers. Mao Zedong normalized brutal crackdown against Chinese citizens and Chinese people. Both Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping also built on Mao's methods of dealing with China's neighbors. While Deng Xiaoping led the unprovoked assault on Vietnam in 1979, Xi Jinping has created tensions in the South China Sea by laying claim to Vietnamese waters. Both followed Mao, who played a key role in the fight against Americans in Korea and Vietnam. But later developed a unique love-hate relationship. This was particularly true for Vietnam, where there was more hate than love over time. Mao Zedong harbored ambitions of ruling Vietnam by proxy. Though he shaped the communist regime in North Vietnam by providing arms, ammunition, logistics, and other help, he desired a much larger role in the region, which Ho Chi Minh, the powerful Vietnamese leader, was not in favor of. In 1954, at the end of the First Vietnam War, at the Geneva Accords, Mao even provided $100 million to North Vietnam. But none of this deterred Ho Chi Minh for keeping and preserving his country's sovereignty. Over time, this has set the stage for how China deals with its neighbors, as a bully who towers over smaller countries. A format that has only been perfected by Xi Jinping with time. All his life, Chairman Mao tried to avoid Stalin's fate. But in the end, the two dictators witnessed fall from grace, though Chairman Mao's fall was less steep. Soon after his death, Deng Xiaoping announced that the country's founder was wrong almost a third of his period in office. He highlighted the ideological and political mistakes that were committed by the great helmsman. Within a month of his death, Mao's widow was put behind bars for crimes committed during the Cultural Revolution. Though Deng didn't tarnish Mao's legacy like Khrushchev vilified Stalin, generations of Chinese have now been indoctrinated to think that Mao's track record in office was just 70-30. The de-Maoization of China started with the embrace of capitalism and jettisoning of Mao's planned economy.
On every May Day, on each October 1st, the national anniversary, 500,000 of them obediently line up in numbered places to cheer Mao atop the huge gate. Then for hours, they parade through the square, a riot of Chinese color. Tiananmen holds a special place for Mao. From August to December 1966, he appeared there before 11 million forcefully cheering Chinese to kick off the Cultural Revolution. Today,
in the next episode, we explain how China rose to become the world's second largest economy. Deng Xiaoping became the architect of modern China. And as the author of China's hide-and-buy doctrine, Deng ushered in the era of SEZs. But in true Mao style, Deng also ordered troops to shoot unarmed students at the Tiananmen Square.